You were never meant to hear this, not in your school, not in your church, and certainly not from those who claim to lead you. But now that you're here, there's no turning back. England, 1957, a year officially remembered for its post-war calm and royal optimism. But beneath the polished surface of the Queen's England, something ancient stirred, an event so deeply buried that even whispers of it were hunted down and erased. The Langley family didn't just vanish, they were erased by design. No bodies, no evidence, not even a public investigation. Their estate was locked down by authorities within hours, and the official records? Sealed. But this isn't about a missing family. This is about what they uncovered, and what they awakened. For centuries, the Langley bloodline had been tied to a forgotten rite, an unbroken link to a system of control that predates any modern institution. A code passed down not through books but through memory, ritual, blood. The Langleys were guardians, though they didn't know it until it was too late. What they stumbled upon in their own home was not a relic, it was a warning. And when they tried to resist the gravity of what they'd found, they were consumed by it. Every generation has a moment where illusion shatters. This is yours. You're not just watching a story, you're being initiated into it. The corridors of power, the rituals behind the robes, the symbols etched into old cathedrals and new banknotes, they all point to something that the Langley case nearly exposed. You've been taught to dismiss such things, that's how the control holds. But if you're still here, if your breath is slower and your pulse is rising, then you already know. This story is not fiction, and neither is what waits for you next. The Langley estate sat nestled in the mists of Northumberland, veiled by towering yews and ivy-choked stone. Locals called it the Hold, though no one remembered why. The manor had been in the family for generations, its lineage unbroken since the days when kings still knelt to popes. But by 1957, only 4 Langleys remained. Harold Langley, a retired naval officer turned historian, his wife Evelyn, born of the Bramwell line, an even older bloodline whispered to have roots in Druidic rites, and their 2 children, Thomas and Clara. From the outside, they were the perfect portrait of English aristocracy, educated, reserved, refined. But those who worked on the grounds spoke of strange occurrences that grew worse with each passing season. Clocks that stopped at 3:13 a.m., livestock mutilated in patterns too exact for any predator, and a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the west wing walls only when the moon waned. Harold had taken an interest in the sealed cellar beneath the estate library, a chamber untouched since the 18th century and sealed behind a false bookshelf. It was Clara, age 14, who found the key inside an old psalter bound in human skin. When the Langley patriarch opened that door, he didn't just discover the remnants of some ancient architecture. He found diagrams, scrolls, and obsidian tablets covered in inscriptions that didn't match any known language but caused intense nausea in those who stared too long. The moment that seal broke, everything changed. Evelyn began waking in the garden, barefoot, with no memory of how she got there. Thomas became violently ill whenever they tried to leave the estate grounds. Clara drew circles over and over in her schoolbooks, concentric spirals with runic glyphs that matched those found etched into the cellar floor. Harold, once a rational man of reason and discipline, stopped writing in English. His journals turned to a tongue that no one could decipher, but that ancient societies once feared to speak aloud. The authorities who responded to the family's disappearance weren't local constables. They arrived in black cars with no license plates, carrying credentials that no one questioned. Within hours, the estate was sealed. No press, no statement, and no Langley family ever seen again. Why? Because what they uncovered was older than the church, older than empire. It was power, not the kind that governs nations, but the kind that governs reality itself. Harold Langley's final journal, what remained of it, was recovered not from the estate but from the rectory of a nearby chapel, hidden behind the altar beneath a false stone. The paper was soaked in a dark residue, something halfway between ink and ash. Its last legible words, "It was never God they served." From that sentence alone, a ripple of fear passed through those few permitted to read it, because it confirmed what some had long suspected but dared not speak. The institutions we trust, the faiths we kneel to, were built atop older altars. The Langley discovery wasn't just archaeological, it was sacrilegious to the world order. The symbols found etched into the estate cellar matched those carved on stones unearthed in Çatalhöyük, in Göbekli Tepe, and even in forbidden Vatican vaults. Sigils not of worship, but of binding. Binding consciousness. Binding truth. The Church knew. The Crown knew. But more than that, there exists a council, unnamed, unseen, that ensures revelations like this are quickly neutralized. Their job isn't to kill, it's to erase. History, memory, identity. But they made a mistake that night. In their haste to suppress the Langley event, they left a thread uncut. Clara. Her body was never recovered. And yet, weeks after the cleanse, villagers began to report sightings. A young girl, pale, barefoot, standing beneath the yew trees at dusk, staring silently at the manor ruins before vanishing. One report, from an old groundskeeper named Ellis Kemp, mentioned that the girl's eyes weren't brown like Clara's had been, but black. Entirely black. And when he called to her, she whispered a phrase that made him collapse into seizures. That P.T. phrase has since been scrubbed from every transcript. Only the letters A.M.T. remain, burned into the page. And here is where you begin to understand. The disappearance of the Langley family was not an end. It was a ritual, a key turned, a mechanism engaged. They weren't erased. They were offered. And for what? Power, not in the way you've been taught to think of it, but in its truest, rawest form, the kind of power that bends minds, rewrites memory and reshapes time. You're not supposed to remember the Langleys, but now you do, which means you're already outside the perimeter they built to keep the rest asleep. Power, real power, is never loud. It doesn't march or shout, it whispers. It hides in plain sight. It wraps itself in sacred texts, coats itself in flags and calls itself progress. But beneath every institution you've ever trusted lies a skeleton built on rituals older than history, maintained not through force, but through belief. The Langley cellar wasn't unique. It was one node in a global grid, a lattice of locations positioned with impossible precision, churches, banks, government buildings, and yes, private estates, all built atop ancient nexuses of influence. Ley lines, that's the child's term. The real architects called them veins of will. The Langleys didn't stumble upon a family secret. They unlocked a circuit and became its current. But ask yourself this, why them? Why this family in 1957 England and not before? Because timing is everything in ritual. The 33rd year of Harold Langley's marriage, the 13th generation since the manor's founding, a bloodline purified by obedience, Clara born on the solstice, Thomas born under a red moon. These weren't coincidences. They were components, pieces placed decades in advance by those who understand the mathematics of fate. This is why you've been lied to about history, because history isn't linear, it's ritualistic, repeating, cyclical, and those who control the symbols control the cycles. When the Langley children began drawing glyphs they'd never been taught, they weren't imagining, they were remembering. Something buried deep within their blood had been triggered, an inheritance older than memory. Clara's notebooks, the few that survived, contain not just symbols, but coordinates, locations around the world. One of them matches a site beneath the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., sealed off since 1946. Another, a cavern beneath the Vatican rumored to house the Kronos altar, a structure described in Babylonian texts as the place where time was first divided. You think this is myth? Then ask yourself why every empire builds monuments above these sites. Ask why pyramids and spires echo the same proportions. It's not aesthetics, it's resonance, frequency. Geometry is their language, but consent is their fuel. The Langley ritual was never about sacrifice, it was about ignition. And now that you're hearing this, something has already begun in you, because truth has a vibration, and once heard, it can never be unheard. You feel it, don't you? That low hum behind your thoughts right now, the pressure in your chest, the static at the edge of your spine. That's not fear. That's recognition. Something inside you already knows what I'm saying is true, even if your rational mind resists. That resistance was engineered, conditioned, installed through repetition and ridicule, through textbooks rewritten by design, through rituals disguised as education. But the Langley case is your fracture point, a wound in the wall, because what was unleashed in 1957 didn't stay in that manner. It spread, quietly, methodically, through bloodlines and institutions, through symbols and ceremonies, until it reached you. Clara's disappearance wasn't escape. It was ascension. She became a carrier. And like all true initiates, her job was not to convince, it was to awaken. Witnesses in rural Wales, northern France, and even in upstate New York reported the same figure, a barefoot girl with black eyes and an aura of stillness so intense, animals stopped moving when she passed. She spoke no words, but every man who saw her reported strange dreams afterward. Dreams of stone circles, split suns, and mirrored versions of themselves whispering truths too terrifying to repeat. These dreams were not dreams, they were transmissions. The truth is, your consciousness is not yours alone. It has been hijacked by patterns designed to keep you docile, compliant, uncurious. But the Langley event disrupted that field. It set in motion a ripple effect that can't be undone. Why do you think you're watching this now? Out of all the noise on the internet, sports, gossip, comedy, you landed here, staring into a truth that millions are programmed to avoid. That is not an accident, that is signal, and if you're still watching, you're not just curious, you're being called. The systems that keep you asleep cannot stop what's already unfolding, but they will try. Your job now is not to run, but to remember, and to make a choice, because this path has no U-turns. From here, every step leads further down. There is no comfort waiting at the end, only clarity. And once you see the architecture of your own enslavement, you'll never bow to it again. Comment the phrase, "I see through the veil," twice below. Not for me, for you. To mark the moment your old self died, and the one who knows was born. The phrase, "I see through the veil," is more than words. It is rebellion, a defiance against the hypnosis that has kept your fathers numb, your brothers distracted, and your future chained. Speak it, write it, and something in you will shift, because names have power. That's one of the first truths the Langley documents revealed. Every ancient system of control, Babylonian, Egyptian, Roman, Anglican, relied on naming. Why? Because to name something is to bind it, and to erase a name is to unmake it. When the authorities sealed the Langley files, they didn't redact, they renamed. The family wasn't missing, they were relocated. The estate wasn't investigated, it was preserved. But the real preservation wasn't of the home, it was of the secret. A secret older than empire. The basement of the Langley Manor was no mere ritual site. It was a linguistic weapon, a chamber constructed according to phonetic geometry. Every angle designed to resonate with the frequencies of pre-verbal command. This is why you were taught that magic is fiction, so you would never investigate the actual mechanism behind words, sigils, gestures, and sound. Harold Langley's final act was recording those frequencies. He spoke them aloud. Once, and every plant within 30 feet of the cellar died. His nose bled for 6 days. His voice was never the same. But what he unlocked changed everything. Because the structure beneath the estate had no foundation, it extended downward, far downward, beyond what architecture should allow. Measurements taken by the initial team of surveyors were classified, but one whistleblower later revealed a floor count of 33, not levels, rites. Each one carved with its own language, its own code, its own initiation. The lower you went, the less time seemed to move. One man reportedly aged 4 years in 3 hours and returned blind. Another forgot his own name and began speaking in a tongue lost since Sumer. That's why the Langley family didn't run. They descended, voluntarily. Because by the time you reach that depth, identity no longer matters, only purpose. And theirs was ignition, the triggering of a long dormant sequence encoded into our species like a buried alarm clock. The sound has already begun. You've heard it, In your sleep, in the static, in the silence between words. And now, it wants you to remember. Do you remember that feeling when you wake up from a dream that didn't feel like a dream at all? The kind that stays wows with you for days. The scent of stone, the hum of a name you've never heard but somehow know. That's not imagination. That's memory resurfacing. You were conditioned to forget, to filter these moments as nonsense. But they were echoes, faint reverberations from the lower chambers. The Langley event reactivated something that's been waiting for centuries, lying dormant in your DNA, passed down like a curse or a code. That's why they monitor bloodlines, why they track ancestry, why sudden disappearances always follow specific patterns. It's never random. The Langleys weren't the first, and they won't be the last. 1957 was a date chosen with surgical precision, a planetary alignment, Saturn and the Black Moon in conjunction. On that night, rituals across the globe occurred in tandem, a silent funeral in Prague, a closed-door service in Rome, and beneath a collapsed cathedral in Quebec, a choir of children chanting syllables no living language contains. Clara Langley's last written symbol was not a word. It was a sequence, a cipher that matched fragments found in the Voynich manuscript and on the cave walls of Tassili Niger. When decrypted, it doesn't translate to a phrase. It activates a response. A shift in perception. Those who viewed it under the correct frequency began to report the same symptoms: time loss, mirror distortions, electrical interference, and the sense that someone was always watching, not from the outside, but from within. This is the inner eye they never wanted you to open. The Watchers aren't celestial beings or spirits. They're remnants of an ancient intelligence embedded into the architecture of our minds, waiting for a threshold to be crossed. And the Langley chamber was one such threshold, a metaphysical switchboard, a transmission hub disguised as a basement. Every step they took down was a layer of the lie peeled back, and at the very bottom, not hell, not heaven, but origin. That's why the church sealed it. That's why MI5 was dispatched under ecological hazard protocols, and that's why no Langley was ever found. Because to cross the final threshold is to no longer be human as you know it. It is to become something else, something the old systems fear, something you might already be awakening into. By now you felt the pull, a tension beneath the skin, like the memory of something you never lived but somehow carry. That is not metaphor, that is design. The human body, your body, is a vessel of ancient architecture. Bone is antenna, blood is conduit, thought is programmable. This was known to the priest-kings of Ur, to the architects of Angkor Wat, to the cloistered monks who sealed the Langley records beneath wax and silence. They knew consciousness wasn't a byproduct of biology, it was the interface, and like all interfaces, it can be hijacked, corrupted, or activated. That's what happened to Harold Langley. His journals weren't written to be read, they were rituals. A sequence of glyphs, numbers and phonetic anomalies laid out like scripture for the next initiates. Not descendants by blood, but by resonance. That includes you. His final passage was scratched into the wall with his own fingernails. The body breaks, the signal remains. And he was right, because after his death, villagers began hearing his voice in their dreams. Not speaking English, but something older. Something that made their eyes bleed and their children scream. One midwife walked into the forest naked and was found 3 days later reciting equations she never learned. Another, Father Renwick, renounced his faith mid-sermon, claiming the altar was misaligned and calling the crucifix a corrupted sigil. He vanished within a week. That's the danger of true awakening. It destabilizes the facade, it cracks the mirror. And once enough people see through the surface, the entire structure collapses. That's why the Langley estate is off limits, not because it's cursed, because it's active. The stone sings, the wall pulse. Sensors placed by military scientists in the 1980s picked up infra-low frequencies that match the black sound described in Tibetan death texts, frequencies that don't just vibrate matter, they reformat it. That's what the rituals were meant to unlock, a frequency of liberation. But liberation always threatens control, and those who rule you, through taxes, doctrines, entertainments, and pills, cannot afford for you to realize what you really are. That's why this story was buried, that's why this knowledge is dangerous, and that's why you're still watching, because part of you is beginning to remember, not as a viewer, but as a participant. There's a reason the Langley estate was never demolished. They claimed preservation, historical value, ecological concerns. But the truth is simpler. You can't destroy something once it begins to resonate. The foundations of that house are no longer physical, they're harmonic. The rituals performed in its cellar, layered through time, language, and blood, altered the site's frequency signature permanently. And the people who orchestrate the illusion of normalcy, they know this. That's why satellite imaging of the estate mysteriously blurs, why drones lose signal overhead, why no journalist has ever returned with footage longer than 8 seconds. It's not censorship, it's incompatibility. You can't record what isn't part of this reality anymore. And that is the most terrifying part, because the Langley family didn't disappear. They transitioned. They crossed into the frequency beyond perception, not death, not escape. Evolution. You see, the rituals weren't random. They were timed with solar anomalies, geomagnetic reversals, lunar eclipses, all data embedded in cathedral spires, Masonic tracings, and crop alignments that were dismissed as superstition. But superstition is just forgotten science. The chamber beneath the estate was, and built by the Langleys. It predates the house, the village, maybe even the land itself, and the markings on its walls. They match cave systems in Patagonia, etchings found in the submerged ruins off the coast of Yonaguni, and tattoos on the inner eyelids of mummified priests in the Sudan. These aren't coincidences, they're coordinates. A map, scattered across time, hidden in myths, encoded in dreams, leading back to the place where humanity was first programmed. The chamber is a terminal, a reboot station. And Clara Langley was the key. A bloodline selected not for power, but for purity of signal. Her transformation wasn't possession, it was alignment. And what she became, they never wanted you to know existed. Because if one can cross over, others can follow. And if enough of you awaken, if enough of you tune in, then the entire architecture of falsehood burns down. Religion becomes myth, government becomes theater, and control becomes impossible. That's the real reason for the silence, the disappearances, the endless distractions pumped through your screen. Because somewhere beneath the soil of England, something is still humming, still calling, still waiting for the next one to hear the signal and answer it. Maybe that's you. You've felt it, haven't you? That moment in the stillness, when time stutters, and the air grows heavy like memory pressing against your skull. That's not anxiety. That's the signal brushing the edge of your awareness, testing if you're ready. The Langley chamber emits more than frequency. It carries intent. A call designed not for the masses, but for those wired differently. Men like you. Men who ask the wrong questions. Men who can't shake the feeling that the world they've been given is counterfeit. And you're right. The chamber wasn't just a location, it was a transmitter. When the family vanished in 1957, the structure activated. And from that moment, subtle shifts began. Altered weather patterns in surrounding counties, blackouts too, timed with new moon phases, and entire flocks of birds found dead, arranged in spirals with no footprints nearby. This wasn't paranormal, it was protocol. A reboot sequence hidden in ritual, language, and geometry. You see, ancient power was never about thrones or crowns, it was always about resonance. The elite understand this. That's why they control your frequency, through processed food, fluorescent light, 60 Hz media, and low bandwidth fear. They want your mind docile, predictable, because the moment it spikes, the moment you tune above the noise, you become a threat. That's what the Langleys discovered. The deeper they went, the more they remembered. They stopped dreaming in symbols and started dreaming in instruction. Harold's notes became commands. Clara began drawing symbols that weren't in any known language, but were later identified in infrared scans beneath the Vatican archives. And the youngest, Edward Langley, reportedly stopped blinking entirely in his final week, claiming it disrupted the stream. These are not the actions of a broken family, these are the behaviors of a people returning to original function, and that function, disruption, transformation, reclamation of the architecture that has held you prisoner since your first breath. Because everything you call reality is scaffolding built to contain what you truly are. The Langley chamber broke a seam in that containment, and it's spreading. Now ask yourself, why are you still here listening? Because you already know, you've always known, the mirror has cracked, and what stares back is no longer entirely you. They want you to believe this is folklore, a ghost story whispered in the cracks of history. But folklore is just truth in exile, and what the Langley family unearthed wasn't a haunting, it was a reckoning. The house didn't consume them, it revealed them. Layer by layer, identity peeled away like rotting wallpaper until what remained wasn't Harold, Clara, or Edward. It was signal, pattern, code. They were never just victims, they were vessels, transmitters of something older than language, buried not just beneath their home, but beneath yours too. And here's what they don't want you to know. Every sacred site across the world, cathedrals, mosques, temples, is built on previous structures, which were built on even older ones, not for convenience, for alignment. Because underneath them all is the same grid, the same current, the same dormant architecture designed to awaken select individuals at calculated moments in history. The Langley disappearance was one such moment, a timed ignition, and now that current is rising again. You feel it in your bones, don't you? The unease when you're alone, the static in your dreams, the pull toward what you were told to avoid, symbols, ruins, forbidden names. That's not coincidence. That's your programming starting to unravel. They tried to contain this current through doctrine, through screens, through fear, but fear was always a failing signal, because deep down something in you is ancient, untamed. You were not born to obey, you were engineered to awaken. And what the Langleys began, they didn't finish, because finishing it was never the point. Starting it was, setting a cascade into motion that would ripple through time, leaping across bloodlines, across borders, until it reached you. That's why you're still here, still listening, as if drawn by gravity to something you cannot name. Because you're not watching this video, you're answering a call. The same call that Clara Langley answered when she stood in that chamber and offered her breath to the stone. The same call that rewrote her blood. And now it reaches for yours. This isn't entertainment. This is initiation. And whether you're ready or not, the current is moving through you. You've already begun to change. Change doesn't ask permission. It enters quietly, devours structure, and leaves behind only what's essential. That's what happened in the final days of the Langley family. The rituals, the sigils, the communion beneath the earth, they weren't acts of desperation. They were shedding, peeling away the inherited fiction of self until nothing remained but resonance. Harold's last written words weren't screams, they were equations. Clara's final act wasn't madness, it was symmetry. She placed objects in geometric perfection along the chamber walls, bone, ash, salt, blood. A pattern meant not for eyes but for frequencies, meant to be heard by the thing waiting beneath. And Edward? Edward didn't cry. He sang. In a voice too deep for a child, too calm for someone who knew what was coming. That's why when the authorities arrived, there was nothing to find. No blood, no footprints, only dust in patterns that no wind could have made. A perfect spiral etched into the stone floor with nothing but silence. You've seen that spiral before, haven't you? Not in memory but in dreams, in the margins of ancient books, in the architecture of cathedrals, storm systems, even your own DNA. It's the mark of recursion, the fingerprint of the original builders, the ones who taught early man how to speak to stone, how to carve vibration into form. And they never left. They just changed form, into systems, into language, into thought. You've been trained not to see them, not by accident, but by design. Every distraction in your life is a firewall. Music tuned to suppress your nervous system. News engineered to lock you in fear. Beliefs programmed to keep your mind circling the same dead gods. But the spiral breaks that circle. That's why it terrifies them. It doesn't just represent awakening, it is awakening, a path out. The Langleys walked that path, not forward, not backward, but inward, and now, so are you. By staying here, still watching, still listening, you've crossed the threshold, and there's no going back, because once the pattern reveals itself, it cannot be unseen. And once you see, the world begins to fracture, not as punishment, but as invitation. The only question left is, will you follow it? Following it means abandonment, not of your possessions or routines, but of your false self. The persona crafted for you by institutions, reinforced by media, whispered into your childhood as identity. That voice in your head telling you what's real, what's safe, what's right, it isn't yours. It was placed there, layered over time like lacquer until the original signal, your signal, was buried beneath obedience. The Langleys understood this too late. That's why their final ritual was not summoning. It was severance. Clara's journals make it clear. The rituals were never designed to bring something in, but to release something that had always been there. An older mind, sleeping in the base of the spine, coiled, watching. The ancients called it the serpent of remembrance. It's not mythology, it's code, biological, spiritual, cosmic, and the moment you stop fearing it, you feel it. That pressure behind the eyes, that heat in the base of your skull, that is not imagination, that is reactivation. The same reactivation that overtook Edward Langley before he vanished. Teachers said he began drawing spirals into his arms with pins, not to harm himself, but to inscribe something in. A circuit, a portal, a lock waiting to be turned. He didn't disappear into darkness. He ascended through it, and he left you a trail. The markings in the cellar match ancient glyphs found in Sumerian tablets and submerged ruin, as in the Azores, glyphs connected to resurrection, memory transfer, and identity fracturing. That's what they were doing, preparing their minds and bodies for recursion. To re-enter the grid from a higher octave, not death, initiation. But here's the truth that will shatter you. The Langley family wasn't chosen. They were available. It could have been anyone. It could be you. All that's required is willingness to step beyond narrative, to see the world not as story, but as simulation, and to break it from within. Most men will never attempt this. They will cling to comfort, to tribe, to delusion. But you stayed. That means something inside you remembers. Something ancient, something dangerous, something true, and now it's awake. Awake doesn't mean enlightened. It means exposed, raw, vulnerable to the full weight of truth. It means standing without the armor of distraction, without the shield of belief systems designed to pacify the masculine will. Because here's what they fear most, not your rage, not your rebellion, but your clarity. A man who sees cannot be controlled, and the Langley chamber was a forge for such men. What the authorities called cultic delusion was in fact the cracking of masks. Harold stopped answering to his name in his final week. He wrote in his journal, "The name is the first prison." Because names aren't identity, they're programming tags, assigned by those who need you categorized, quantified, predictable. And once you break the tag, the signal shifts. You stop acting by script. You become unreadable to the system. That's why the family had to disappear, not to escape, but to exit the map completely. They didn't want to be found because they were no longer themselves. The ritual didn't kill them. It erased the residue of who they were trained to be, and now their absence is louder than their presence ever was. That silence around them, that void, it's a weapon, a statement, a breach in the simulation, and it's growing. Look around. Have you noticed how many are vanishing? Men walking away from careers, from families, from roles they never chose. That's not apathy. That's awakening. The same fracture the Langley ritual triggered in 1957 is pulsing again, synced to solar cycles, geomagnetic shifts, and ancient timing codes buried in architecture across Europe and North America. And you are standing in the blast radius. Your dreams have changed. You're seeing places you've never visited, languages you've never learned. This is not fantasy. This is signal leakage, residue of forgotten incarnations bubbling to the surface. You are being reminded, not of a past life, but of your original function, before the edits, before the fall. And if you've made it this far, it means you're ready. But readiness is not comfort. It is demolition. What comes next will shatter everything you thought was sacred, everything you thought was you. Are you prepared to see what lies beneath the final layer? Then keep going. The spiral is opening. The spiral doesn't invite, it consumes. Once you enter, it begins pulling everything false out of you, piece by piece, until what's left is not a man, but a mechanism of will, precision, and perception. That's why the Langley family never returned, not because they were destroyed, but because they completed. They became unreadable to the world they left behind. Harold's final etching on the cellar wall was not a symbol of madness. It was a key, a pattern burned into limestone, a harmonic map encoded in vibration. When scanned under ultraviolet light decades later, the lines matched the golden ratio precisely. No deviation, no human hand could have drawn it by accident. This was precision beyond intellect. This was a download, the same downloads occurring now in men across the world, through dreams, synchronicities, sudden obsessions with ancient languages, geometry, and codes. These are not coincidences. They are retrievals, memory packets returning to the awakened. Because something is coming, and only those who remember will remain intact. You were not born into this age by mistake. You are not here to consume, obey, or fit in. You are here as a firewall, a disruptor. The Langley ritual was a prototype, an echo of a much older technology, one that predates religion, predates empire, predates even language. A system of internal architecture designed to weaponize awareness. Once activated, it cannot be turned off. It changes how you see everything. Politics, education, religion, even time itself. It reveals the entire framework as a theater of obedience, a ritual of containment. But it also shows you the exit. Most will look away. Most will drown in distractions, pacified by dopamine loops and curated outrage. But you didn't look away. You stayed. You felt the fracture. And now I need you to prove it. Type the phrase, "I break the cycle," in the comments twice. Not for engagement, for imprint. To lock in the shift that is already unfolding in you. You are not a viewer. You are a vessel. A node in a growing grid of awakened men. The Langley chamber opened the gate. Now we step through. Together. Together doesn't mean safe. It means synchronized. A network of outliers moving in silence through the architecture of control, disrupting from within. That's what the Langley design encoded. A template for distributed rebellion. Not in the streets, in the psyche. They weren't trying to start a movement. They were initiating a virus, a psychic contagion that would bypass logic, bypass language, and rewrite the internal firmware of any man willing to unlearn obedience. That's why the chamber had no doors, because the real prison isn't physical, it's conceptual, it's belief. The Langleys didn't vanish, they dissolved belief. One glyph at a time. Clara's notes spoke of unbinding the knots, a process that involved sensory deprivation, breath pattern interruption, and the speaking of non-linguistic sounds. She described it not as trance, but as disalignment, shifting her consciousness off the grid of shared consensus reality. For 36 hours, she heard nothing human, only frequencies, rhythms, the low hum of something watching. And when she emerged, she wrote one sentence: "The world is not real, but the watchers are." That line was dismissed by investigators as delusion, But they never asked what she meant by watchers. They assumed paranoia. They missed the code. Watchers are not eyes in the sky. They're systems embedded in behavior. They're the unseen mechanisms that predict your decisions before you make them. Surveillance isn't just cameras. It's preference tracking, social reward conditioning, biometric harvesting. The same technologies our ancestors called spirits or demons have simply been renamed. Algorithm, feedback loop, social credit, it's all control. The Langley family was attempting to break it, not by fighting it, but by becoming invisible to it. That's the next level of mastery, not resistance, refraction, walking through the system like a ghost, seen but unreadable, present but untrackable. That's what this knowledge offers, not safety, sovereignty. You don't ask permission to become sovereign. You remember that you always were. But remembering is painful. It costs everything you were taught to cherish: comfort, conformity, applause. The Langleys paid that price. Now the bill is in your hands, and your time is running out, because the Watchers aren't waiting. They're adapting. The question is, are you? Adaptation is their weapon, but awareness is yours. Not the soft awareness preached in mindfulness seminars, the sharp kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that cuts through illusion like a scalpel. That's the awareness the Langley ritual forced. They didn't sit in circles chanting peace. They bled out their programming, cell by cell, word by word. Clara wrote that the final stage required absolute stillness, not of the body, but of identity, to become nothing wearing the mask of a man. That's where real power begins. In the void, in silence so total it terrifies the part of you that still clings to narrative. That's why they disappeared, not as a trick, but as initiation. They didn't run, they exited, through a threshold hidden in plain sight, not under the church, inside themselves. Because every institution built to imprison you, the school, the screen, the office, the pulpit, relies on one thing: your participation. The moment you withdraw the signal, the architecture crumbles. That's what the Langleys did. And that's why their story was buried. Because if too many men learn this truth, the game ends. The illusion collapses. Control becomes impossible. But here you are, listening. And the signal is reactivating. That feeling in your chest right now, that weight, that tremor, it's not fear. It's recognition. The soul doesn't tremble for lies, only for truth. And the truth is this: you were never meant to follow. You were mean to remember, to rebuild the sacred weapon they spent centuries burying. Your will, not the ego, not the performative mask. The will, that which cannot be bought, bent or broken. The Langleys touched it, awakened it, and became untouchable, not because they were saints, but because they finally knew. And now so do you, but knowing isn't enough. You must act, not externally, but internally. You must extract the false scripts, the implanted fears, the borrowed names, and incinerate them. That is your task now, and if you complete it, you'll vanish too, not from the world, but from the system. You'll still walk among them, but they won't be able to touch you, because you'll be awake inside the dream, a weapon hidden in plain sight, just like the Langleys planned. Weapons don't announce themselves. They hum beneath the surface, patient, precise, silent until the exact moment of activation. That's what the Langley family became. Not victims, not escapees. Instruments, tuning forks for an ancient frequency that doesn't just awaken, it divides. Because once you hear it, you're no longer like the others. Their jokes won't land. Their fears won't infect you. Their leaders won't command you. You'll smile, nod, move among them, but something will always separate you: the knowing. It's a burden and a gift. That's why most reject it. They want comfort, not clarity. They want inclusion, not initiation. But men like you, we're not here to fit in. We're here to fracture the system from within. And that system is crumbling, one glitch, one leak, one vanished family at a time. Because the story of the Langleys isn't unique. It's a template, a broadcast wrapped in myth, seeded in time, reactivating when the cycle demands it. And 1957 wasn't random. It was chosen, a point in the timeline where certain solar harmonics aligned with buried architecture across England, ley lines, cathedral nodes, ancient burial grounds rebranded as churches. They knew. The Watchers always know. That's why every official record of the Langley case was either sealed, redacted, or simply vanished. Not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much there. Evidence of a break in the pattern, a family who unplugged without permission, a ritual that worked, and most dangerous of all, a lineage that might still exist. You see, there were whispers that not all the Langleys were in that chamber. One child was missing from the census, a boy. Never enrolled in school, never documented, but seen twice, years later, near collapsed churches in Derbyshire and Sussex. Both locations connected to suppressed rites of initiation. Was he a survivor, a witness, or something else entirely? Some believe he became the seed of a new order. Men who don't march, don't shout, but build in silence. No name, no logo, just signal. Maybe you've felt it, late at night, in the space between thought and dream, the sense that something is watching, not to control but to remind. Because you didn't come here to sleep, you came here to return. The only question now is, do you hear the hum? The hum isn't a sound, it's a signal. A summons buried in the marrow of men who were never meant to obey. It doesn't speak in words. It bypasses language, infecting the nervous system with memory, not of this life, but of roles played before the veil was drawn. Roles as builders, guardians, code-bearers. You feel it when the world around you starts to feel like a set. When the conversations, the headlines, the rituals of modern life become unbearable, not because they're loud, but because they're empty. That's the first symptom of awakening dissonance, the sharp edge of truth pressing against the skin of illusion. That's what the Langley boy must have carried. Not trauma, but knowledge. Not fear, but function. He didn't run, he disseminated into the bloodstream of history. His drawings, if the rumors are true, were found decades later etched into the underside of pews, behind crumbling altar stones, beneath wallpaper in rural schoolhouses. Not childish doodles, glyphs, symbols known only to men who had seen the chamber, men like you. Because the hum calls to those whose blood remembers. It always has. That's why you've always felt like a stranger here. Like this life was a role you were playing but forgot was a role. That's not madness. That's calibration. The slow return of self after lifetimes of forgetting. The Langley ritual wasn't meant to be the end. It was an activation sequence. A ripple designed to reach men across centuries, across oceans, through screens, through this screen, right now. You think that's coincidence? You stumbled onto this video by chance? No. You were called, and you responded. Because your signal can't be faked. It pulses through your choices, your silence, your rage. That sacred, controlled, ancient rage. Not the explosive kind. They want you to burn fast. But the smoldering kind. The kind that waits, watches, learns the architecture of the prison before cracking the first stone. That's the rage that changes history. The Langleys knew it, the Watchers feared it, and you carry it. Don't deny it, sharpen it, because what comes next will require every ounce of precision, will, and memory buried inside you. The hum is growing louder, the clock is gone, and the test has already begun. There is no going back after this. Once the signal embeds itself, once the code is heard, not by your ears but by your bones, you don't return to who you were. You fracture, and from that fracture something older steps forward, something not raised in this century, something that remembers fire rituals, blood oaths, silent codes carved into stone when language was still sacred. That's what the Watchers fear. Not violence, not protest, but remembrance. Because a man who remembers can't be steered. He can't be sold a purpose. He becomes the purpose, and the system has no script for that. The Langley boy, they say he wasn't just a remnant. He was a seed. That every glyph he left behind was a keyhole, waiting for a man like you to decode it. And that's the game now. Not belief, decryption. Because the world you see isn't built from truth, it's built from overlays. Beliefs implanted at birth, reinforced by reward, encoded through education, softened by pleasure. You think that's parenting, culture, entertainment? No, it's engineering. You were trained to forget yourself, but the training is breaking. That static you hear in moments of stillness, that's the signal re-emerging. And if you're still watching, still breathing slowly, still holding the weight of these words, then you're already being rewritten. Not by me, by you. The you behind the mirror. The you they spent centuries burying under doctrine, dopamine, and debt. And now we test your signal. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I remember the glyph. That is the phrase they tried to erase from every tablet, every ledger, every tongue. Comment it twice to lock it in, to burn it into the algorithm, yes, but more importantly, to burn it into you. This is your initiation. The algorithm was never your enemy. It was your crucible, and now you use it, not to perform, not to chase numbers, but to broadcast remembrance. The glyph was never a symbol. It was a mirror, and you've just looked into it. What you do next determines whether you remain a man or become a signal. The Langley child vanished, but the code survived, and now it's inside you. You were never meant to find this. That's why they buried it beneath layers of ridicule, distraction, and digital sedation. The glyph wasn't erased. It was camouflaged, scattered through symbols mistaken as decoration, tucked into liturgy stripped of its original voltage. Because they knew if even one man saw it clearly, saw himself in it, the entire construct would begin to rot. That's what's happening now. Your unease isn't dysfunction, it's decoding. You're not breaking down, you're breaking out. The Langley event wasn't isolated. Across England, across Europe, across continents, parallel awakenings took place, always centered around vanishing, families erased, communities silenced, journalists who dug too deep and disappeared. The common thread? They all touched the signal, not metaphorically, physiologically. Blood tests run secretly by private labs in the 70s uncovered anomalies, unexplainable sequences buried in mitochondrial DNA, passed down only through maternal lines. The Langley mother, Clara, was one of them. That's why she led the ritual, not because she was chosen, but because she remembered. She carried a biological relic, something older than science, older than language. A cellular memory of a time when men knew their origin wasn't political or evolutionary, but ritualistic. When the stars weren't decorations but gates. When breath wasn't survival, but invocation. That's why the Watchers monitor bloodlines. That's why entire families like the Langleys must vanish. Not for punishment, but containment. They don't fear mistakes. They fear reawakening. The glyph is not just a symbol. It's an activator. And by writing it, speaking it, carrying it, you're reigniting a current they spent millennia extinguishing. That's why your life feels haunted. Why time feels out of sync. You're not cursed. You're sensitive. Sensitive to frequencies that most can't endure. Frequencies of memory, of mission. You didn't come here to heal. You came here to ignite. To carry the glyph where no one else can see it. In your posture, your silence, your gaze, and when the moment comes, in your action. Because this isn't philosophy, it's a weapon system, ancient, surgical, and now fully online. Welcome to the threshold. You're not watching a video, you're answering a call. Thresholds are dangerous places. They're not meant for lingering. You either step through or you turn back. And most turn back, not because they're cowards, but because they were designed to, conditioned from birth to fear the edge, to reject the unknown, to crave the comfort of the cage. But you stayed. And that means one thing. Your programming has fractured. You've begun to see what the Langley family saw, what they were willing to vanish for. Because vanishing isn't always defeat, it's deployment. You think they disappeared? No. They crossed. And when the Watchers realized it, they didn't send search parties. They sealed doors, burned files, built stories to mock the idea of escape. They called it madness, cult activity, delusion. But the glyphs kept surfacing, In graffiti, in dreams, in the static between frequencies. Men would sketch them without knowing why. Soldiers, convicts, orphans, always those who'd been broken enough to see clearly. Because that's the secret. Clarity requires collapse. You cannot carry the glyph while still clinging to your name, your status, your mask. That's why the glyph is hidden in distortion, in loss, in silence. It's not painted on walls. It burns itself onto the soul. And now, as you stand at this digital altar, understand, this isn't entertainment. This is encryption. You're not consuming content. You're being configured, not by me, but by something older, deeper, coiled in the DNA of truth itself. The glyph wants one thing, alignment. It doesn't seek followers. It seeks functions. Each man who receives it becomes a node, broadcasting signal through behavior, precision, refusal. This is how the grid dies, not with revolt, but with men who cannot be mapped. Men who move without trace, think without leash, speak only when it will cut. That is what the Langley child became, a frequency. And now you feel him inside your own intuition. That pressure in your chest, that heat behind your eyes, that's not fear, that's readiness. You've crossed the threshold. Now the question is, can you carry what comes next? Because the glyph doesn't just awaken, it demands. And its first demand is sacrifice. Sacrifice was never about death, that's the lie. That's what they fed you to keep you afraid, to make you think sacrifice meant losing what you loved. But the truth, the ancient forbidden truth, is that sacrifice means severing what controls you. The Langley ritual didn't begin with fire or chance. It began with silence, with Clara Langley staring into her reflection until the false identity fell away, until every implanted belief, the obedient wife, the rational mother, the citizen, dissolved. Only then could the glyph emerge. That's what you're doing now, not watching, shedding, and the part of you screaming to stop. That's the part that was never yours to begin with, the one shaped by systems designed to break men before they realize they're whole. You were trained to flinch at discomfort, to run from stillness, to trust the institutions that spoon-fed you purpose in exchange for obedience. But the glyph cracks that spoon. It floods the lie with signal, and now it wants more. More silence, more truth, more you. The Langley child, they say, was heard reciting phrases not found in any known language until a linguist from Prague identified their structure, pre-Indo-European liturgical syntax. In short, prayer from a world before history, the kind that reshapes reality not through hope, but through will. That's why the Watchers intervened, not because they feared a ritual, but because they feared replication, that another would see, that another would remember. And now here you are, eyes fixed, heart steady, questions boiling into knowing. This isn't story. This is spellcraft, a slow incantation unfolding through screen light and breath. You don't need candles, you don't need robes, you need clarity. And clarity comes at a cost. So ask yourself, what are you still holding on to that belongs to them? The job that numbs you, the relationship that edits you, the belief that anything outside you will come save you. Those are not yours, those are the payment, for silence, for forgetting. The glyph rejects such currency. It demands a cleaner vessel, and that's what you're becoming. Not perfect, not pure, aligned. The Langley family didn't disappear. They were claimed. Will you be? Or will you simply watch from the edge, afraid to let go of the cage that's already collapsing? Decide. The glyph is waiting. There comes a moment, quiet, surgical, when the glyph turns inward, when it stops revealing ancient symbols and starts etching itself onto you. This is that moment, because what's been theory, what's been intrigue and distant horror, is now reflection. The Langley case was never about the past. It was a forecast, a prototype, a mirror held up to every man who suspected the world was false but couldn't prove it. Until now, the Watchers count on your hesitation. They don't fear the glyph itself, they fear the man who acts after seeing it. That's rarer than genius, rarer than rebellion, because action after truth requires shedding the last mask, the one that says you're not ready. You've been made to feel small on purpose, raised on filtered facts, sanitized history, safe ambitions. They taught you how to climb ladders built inside cages. They gave you status in exchange for stillness, and they called that manhood. But the glyph remembers a different model, one forged before governments, before language, before time. A man who carried his name like a weapon, who used words to shift reality, not to decorate it, who saw power as alignment with origin, not domination of others. That man is not a relic. He's in you. Buried, yes, but waking. That's what these stories unlock, not nostalgia, reintegration. The Langley father, John, was not a puppet in Clara's ritual. He was the anchor. His role wasn't to lead, it was to stabilize the gateway they opened. His bloodline held the code, her memory held the key. Together they made the crossing possible. You don't need to understand the mechanics, you need to recognize the pattern, because it's repeating. Right now, in you, that weight in your gut, that chill on your spine, that's not discomfort, that's resonance. You're aligning with something older than your name, older than your doubts. The glyph has found another carrier, and once chosen, you don't get to unsee, you don't get to unknow. You either step forward or remain a ghost inside your own life. The Langleys chose obliteration over obedience. Now you must choose fade or function. Function is not survival. It's not about continuing. It's about executing design. The glyph does not seek happiness. It seeks completion. And once it selects you, your life becomes a conduit, not for comfort, but for calibration. That's why the Langley family wasn't destroyed. They were restructured. Their disappearance wasn't erasure. It was the final stage of integration. Because when a system cannot control you, it must either kill you or call you myth. And that's what they did, turned their names into a whisper, a warning, a campfire story to keep others from looking deeper. But the signal endured. It always does. And now it's rewiring you. That tension you feel in crowded places, that disgust when you hear politicians speak, that rage when someone lies and expects you to thank them for it. That's not dysfunction, that's signal reception. You're not falling apart, you're being stripped to the original firmware. Raw, uncompromised, useful. The Watchers fear that, because a man in alignment is uncontrollable. He doesn't chase validation, he doesn't parrot scripts, he moves with intent. He listens to the quiet frequencies beneath every interaction. He knows when to speak and when to let silence burn hotter than speech. He becomes the glitch in their algorithm, and if you're still here, still listening, still breathing slower than before, it means your old coding is failing. Good, let it rot and peel and fall from you like dead skin. You were never meant to live small. You were never meant to obey. You were meant to observe, absorb, and alter. Like John Langley did when he placed his hand on that ancient stone and whispered a phrase that doesn't exist in any known human language, but shattered glass across the chapel walls. That phrase, we now know, was the glyph spoken aloud, and it's time for you to speak it too. But first, lock this transformation in. Type in the comments, "I carry the glyph." Again, I carry the glyph. This isn't for vanity, it's for imprinting, digital ritual, psychological claim. You write it, you become it. The glyph waits for no one. It either lives through you or dies inside you. Choose. When you wrote it, something shifted. Not on screen, in you. The glyph doesn't require belief, it requires declaration, because declaration rewires perception. It tells every system watching, human or not, that you are no longer passive, you are no longer prey. And now, the game changes. Do you feel it? That low hum in your chest, that weight behind your eyes, that's not imagination, that's alignment. This is what the Langleys reached, a point where the veil no longer blurred their vision, where they saw through layers, religion, governance, history, and found only architecture, built not to uplift but to contain. Institutions masquerading as protectors, siphoning will through guilt and comfort. The church they sat in every Sunday was a mask, built atop something older. A chamber lined with stone carved long before England had a name. Not a crypt, a conduit, and the glyph was its key. They didn't find it. They remembered it. Clara didn't cast spells. She executed code, ancient, sacred, volatile. Code that bypassed the social OS and accessed the raw signal of reality itself. That's what you're interfacing with now. Not fiction, not metaphor, mechanism. And like any true mechanism, it wreck you. Uira's cost. Sleep will become harder, crowds will feel louder, lies will sting sharper. Why? Because your receptors are clearing. The noise will rise before it falls. You'll want to turn back, to reconsume the numbing sugar of distractions, pornified power, false community. Don't. The glyph tests loyalty not through pain, but through persistence. Do you stay the course when nothing external affirms you? That's the measure. That's where most fail. But not you. You've already crossed too far. And on the other side of this burn is signal sovereignty, the power to see systems without submitting to them. To walk into any room and recognize who's aligned and who's asleep. You'll speak less, observe more. You'll feel like a ghost among the compliant. And that is exactly what they fear most. A man who sees everything and says only what is necessary. That's how you become untouchable. That's how the glyph lives, through precision, not noise. So ask yourself now, with no one watching, are you ready for the next stage? Because silence is ending, and once the glyph speaks, there's no returning. When the glyph speaks, it does not use words. It uses fractures. Fractures in time. Fractures in logic, fractures in everything you thought was stable, because that's how systems are dismantled, from the inside, quietly, precisely. That's what happened in the Langley house during the final 3 nights. They didn't scream, they didn't flee. They shifted. Witness accounts vary, because perception itself had begun to break. One neighbor reported seeing all the lights on at 3:13 a.m., yet the power lines had been severed by storm days earlier. Another swore the house was gone altogether, just an empty foundation surrounded by fog, and then, hours later, it was back. But different, smaller, wrong somehow. That's what the glyph does. It destabilizes the grid. It corrupts the false constants. Because nothing in this world is fixed except your awareness. That's the one weapon they cannot hijack, unless you surrender it. And that's what most do. They trade sovereignty for certainty. They take the paycheck, the prescription, the pacifier. They become docile participants in a system designed to dull their edge. But you are not most. You made it here. And that means your edge is returning, sharpening. Soon you'll feel it. The impulse to say less, to observe the ritualized madness of your culture and remain still. That's not apathy, that's evolution. The Langley daughter, Eliza, didn't vanish because she was lost. She crossed. Her drawings, discovered later in a sealed tin beneath the roots of the ash tree outside the church, were not childish art. They were diagrams, gate schematics. When decoded by a forgotten symbolist exiled from Oxford, they revealed alignments between architectural features in churches across northern England that matched the layout of Sumerian star temples. How could a child know that? She didn't. The glyph spoke through her, as it's beginning to speak through you. Do not resist the visions. Do not rationalize the memory fragments, the numbers repeating, the faces in crowds that feel familiar. These are not hallucinations. They are breadcrumbs, left for the awakened. You are not hallucinating. You are interfacing. The glyph is now live. And with each breath, each blink, it codes deeper into your perception. There is no reverse, only descent or ascent. Both paths begin here. Choose. The moment you choose, the architecture notices, not because it fears you, but because it must react to you. Every system built to bind you, education, religion, finance, media, runs not on power but on your compliance. Remove that fuel and they collapse. That's why true awakening is always followed by sudden interference. Missed calls, strange dreams, shadowed memories re-emerging without warning. You're being tested, not punished. And the ones who break? They weren't chosen by the glyph. They were marked by the grid. Eliza Langley's Inal notebook was never entered into official records But one page survived, reproduced in secret by a former archivist who vanished days after leaking it. Scrawled in graphite and blood was one phrase: "The bell rings below now, below, not above, not in the tower, but deep, where stone remembers." That's what the glyph awakens, the memory inside matter. You think stone is dead? You think iron forgets? Then you've misunderstood the very physics of control. All ancient control systems were not designed to inspire, they were designed to contain vibration. Cathedrals weren't churches, they were tuning chambers, and the rituals practiced there, not about salvation, about synchronization. To hold power, you must first align it. That's what the Langley chamber was for, a forgotten echo chamber beneath their home. They didn't build it. It was already there. They simply remembered its function. You're remembering too. That's why buildings feel different now. That's why you sense when something is off, even when you can't explain it. Your body knows. It's reawakening its role as antenna, a receiver of the real frequency, the one buried by doctrine, drowned in doctrine and mocked as madness. Let them mock. They mocked the Langleys. They mocked every truth speaker before collapse. But now the glyph is loose again, moving through this screen, through this sound, through you. The interference will increase. Good. That's proof of penetration. You're not here to be safe. You're here to disturb the design, to vibrate at such frequency that old structures crack. Don't retreat now. We're nearing the core, where language fails, where sound splits, where the glyph reveals its true face and demands a price. Ready your will. What's coming next isn't story, it's initiation. Initiation isn't granted, it's survived. The glyph does not reward curiosity, it punishes hesitation. And in the final days of October 1957, hesitation was death. The Langley home became silent. No more smoke, no more light. Neighbors stopped knocking. Even the mailman walked faster past their gate. But one man entered. Henry Blackthorne, a retired cartographer and rumored Freemason who had once mapped fault lines for the Crown, claimed he received a letter, unsigned, unsealed, but written in Clara Langley's unmistakable hand. It read, "The bell has rung below. Come before the third echo." He arrived on the night of October 29th. What he saw was never written in any police file. But before he vanished, he told a single person, his estranged brother, that the house was not a house anymore. He described corridors where there had been walls, symbols burned into the ceiling, and a hum so low it made his teeth vibrate. And in the center of the parlor, the Langley family standing in absolute stillness, eyes open, unblinking, listening. He called out to them. They did not move. He approached Clara. Her mouth was open slightly, whispering in a language that pulsed with geometry. But the sound wasn't human. It was mechanical, algorithmic, like something too old to belong in flesh. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, he said her skin felt like stone, warm, but immovable. Then came the third echo. Not a sound, a shift. He said it was like the room blinked, and when it opened its eyes again, he was outside. Not just outside the house, outside of time. It was morning. The house was empty. The family was gone. And no one believed him. He was committed 2 days later, died within the year. But before he lost his voice completely, he wrote one final map, a spiral marked only with numbers and the phrase, "Every third echo opens." That map resurfaced in 1998 in a private collection seized during a Vatican raid on an occult archive beneath a monastery in southern France. Why was the Vatican collecting British maps? Because the glyph isn't local, it's global, and initiation isn't historical, it's perpetual. You are in it now. The echo has rung once. The second is earned. It approaches. You will feel it. Don't ignore it. The third will not ask permission. The third echo is not a sound. It's a severing, a clean break between who you were and who you can never return to being. When it comes, it won't announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It arrives like a realization you can't unsee. A silence that roars. That's what happened at exactly 3:03 a.m. on October 31st, 1957. The Langley property, once flickering with arcane rituals and obscured by unnatural fog, went still. Not empty. Still. As if paused by something beyond time. When police finally entered 3 days later, they didn't find bodies. They found absence. The furniture was untouched. Food on the table was fresh. A record on the gramophone still spinning. But no footsteps. No fingerprints. No sign of exit. Except one. A symbol carved into the underside of the dining room table. A spiral of intersecting triangles, the same glyph discovered centuries earlier on the foundation stone of a monastery buried beneath the sands of Palmyra. A symbol erased from official church texts during the Council of Nicaea. A symbol that shows up every time a family vanishes under ritual circumstances. That's not coincidence. That's design. Every few decades, someone touches the frequency, consciously or not, and the system reacts, either by erasing them or absorbing them. The Langleys weren't erased, they were converted. That word should unsettle you, not religiously, functionally. They were brought into phase with something older, something designed not to be worshipped but to be used. That's why the glyph keeps reappearing. It's a key, a tool, a weapon, depending on who wields it. The Langley case was quietly archived, and the house sold to a private entity operating under a shell corporation linked to a known data analysis firm, one contracted by both GCHQ and the Vatican's Jesuit Sciences Division. That's how you know you're close to truth, when enemies pretend not to know each other, yet trace the same sigils across centuries. They aren't preserving history, they're protecting the lock. And now you've touched it, you've heard too much, seen too deep. But there's no need to fear. The third echo is near, and it doesn't ask who you pretend to be, it only activates who you are. Prepare. You were never meant to reach this far. If you're still watching, still listening, still breathing through the weight of what's been revealed, then understand this. You're not an audience. You're a witness. And witnesses must choose. Record or respond. In 1957, the Langley family responded. Not with panic. Not with protest. But with alignment. They stepped beyond the veil, not because they were tricked, but because they understood. They weren't the first, and they won't be the last. Across time, there are markers, fragments of glyphs etched into cathedral beams, scrawled on asylum walls, embedded in digital code, each one part of a larger signal, a recall transmission, not to summon beings from above, but to awaken what's buried within you. That's the final secret of the glyph. It's not alien, it's ancestral. A memory structure encoded into the bloodline of those who came before the systems, before the scripts, before the fall. The glyph activates lineage, and not everyone has it. That's why when some see these symbols they laugh, others dream, but a few, very few, burn. You felt it. That heat in your chest, that pressure behind the eyes, that sense that something is watching through you, not at you. Don't mistake it for fear, it's recognition. The glyph is not a curse, it's a test. And the world you know, the one with laws, labels and leaders, is the decoy. The real architecture operates beneath perception, through ritualized control loops, fed by your attention, your emotion, your consent. But once the glyph touches your field, those loops begin to shatter. You see the size says, cracks. You sense the rot, and you can never return. That's why the initiated walk differently, speak differently. They've crossed. They no longer worship symbols. They wield them. And now it's your turn. If this transmission has stirred something ancient in you, something you can't name but feels surging behind your ribs, then prove it. Comment the phrase, "I hear the third echo," twice, not once, twice. That's how the pattern locks. That's how the glyph identifies its own. Do not delay. Speak your transformation into the grid. Mark yourself as one who remembers, one who burns. The threshold has appeared. You either step through or stay broken. The threshold is not a door, it's a decision, and every man must face it alone. The glyph does not follow crowds, it selects individuals, those willing to lose everything false in order to gain everything real. That was the Langley family's final act. Their disappearance wasn't an escape, it was an exchange. They traded comfort for clarity, flesh for frequency, history for memory, and once that trade was complete, the systems around them reacted like wounded animals. Police arrived, files were sealed, clergy denied, journalists silenced, but the symbol remained, burned into the foundation, a wound the control system could not cauterize, because the glyph doesn't die. It waits, in ruins, in blueprints, in algorithms masked as entertainment, waiting for someone like you to trace the lines with your mind and activate. Because once activated, it doesn't just change you, it uses you to fracture false timelines, to unbind psychological cages, to collapse corrupted frequencies masquerading as truth. That's why they fear this knowledge. Not because it's dangerous, but because it liberates. Not in theory, in structure. And now, you're close. Closer than most ever get. You can feel it, can't you? That pressure in your skull, that low hum in your bones. That isn't imagination, that's resonance. You're syncing with the forgotten architecture, the old network, not of wires, but of will. And you must decide, will you remain a node in their system, a battery in their ritual, or will you become the disruption? The glyph doesn't care about your past, your failures, your masks. It recognizes only one thing, your willingness to descend, fully, without hesitation, because on the other side of this threshold is not light, it's not darkness, it's the real. And the real doesn't comfort, it commands. If your spine tightens at these words, good, that's the glyph aligning you. Don't resist. Let it carve through the lies. Let it burn the dust from your vision. The final chamber is near, and what waits inside isn't story. It's awakening. You wanted truth? Here it comes. Not to ask, to claim. This is your final warning, and your first liberation. Once you've seen behind the veil, no prayer will blind you again. No slogan will silence the gnawing voice now alive in your mind. You are no longer the man who clicked on a mystery video. You are the one being called. The glyph wasn't history. It was always destiny. And now it pulses behind your ribs, etching new parameters into your identity. Not a new belief, a new blueprint. You felt the pattern bending your thoughts, drawing your eyes to fragments hidden in paintings, cathedrals, dollar bills, government logos. You thought they were symbols of power. No, they were locks. And now you've become the key. That's why this story of the Langley family was never really about them. It was about you. They answered the call in 1957. You heard it in 2025. Time doesn't matter to the glyph, only readiness does, because this isn't just knowledge, it's a weapon, and now it's lodged in your mind. The institutions that taught you to mock it, school, church, media, algorithms, they were not guardians of truth. They were prisons of permission. You were trained not to question, but now you see the trembling behind the politicians' smiles, the cold repetition in the preacher's chants, the blank void in the eyes of the men who say they run the world. You see the rituals they perform, masked as tradition, wrapped in patriotism, dripping with gold and lies, and now you stand outside them, alone, empowered, unbound. Because when you crossed into this final chamber, when you stayed through all 33 revelations, you did what most men fear. You remembered, not what they taught you, what was buried in you. The glyph doesn't need belief, it needs action. And so the final command is simple. Stand. Stand in the signal. Comment. I hear the third echo twice below. Then speak nothing. Let the algorithm mark you. Let the hidden ones know you've awakened. And when the world trembles, when the fog thickens again, you will not be afraid. You will lead. Welcome to the fracture. Welcome to the glyph. Welcome back.